Oh, hello, Martin. It's a good intro.
Oh, it's a shocker.
I'm gonna do it again, even though Martin's not going to cut it out.
No,
G'day, everyone, and
it's better.
welcome to the latest episode of Infection Control Matters.
Which is actually a traditional Australian hello, and yet you're not even in Australia.
I know. We are in Napier.
Yeah, we're in
New
Napier,
Zealand.
New Zealand.
And we've got two beautiful stags looking at us.
Yeah.
And that's not you, Martin. That's
No.
literally two stags on the wall in the place where...
Yes, it's unfortunately only about 10% of the stag because everything from the neck is missing.
Yeah, that's true.
There we are.
But it is a lovely place. Got a nice bookcase behind us and some leather chairs.
Yeah.
And we were reminiscing about how lucky we are to be involved in infection control and to talk about fantastic things that are happening in that area.
Yeah, whatever we like, really. Which is
Yeah.
good.
So on that note,
You found a paper you wanted to
I
look
did. Yeah. We've been talking about toilets
at. Ugh.
during our recent. We've been together on and off the last couple of weeks with some work and.
I'm going to say my best toilet story was the sign on the wall in the Adelaide airport toilets,
Yeah.
which said, "Our water used for flushing the toilets is recycled water. Please don't drink it." I think, how desperate are people when they need to be warned
how
not to
stupid
drink
are
toilet
people?
water? Well, yeah.
To have signs like that.
But anyway,
Yeah,
toilets.
So toilets. We have talked about toilets in previous podcasts, and they've been quite a popular topic, I must say. We do get a bit of feedback about the toilet ones. And there's a new paper out in AJIC, American Journal for Infection Control, by Charles Gerber, his group. Stephanie Boone is the lead author, and they wanted to look at the impact of air sanitizer spray on the risk of viral transmission of aerosols generated from flushing. So essentially, could you spray some kind of sanitizer, and would that reduce the risk of aerosol contamination?
No, they centred on viruses, didn't
They did center on
Whereas
viruses.
other pathogens
yes.
are available.
There are many
from
other
toilets.
pathogens.
Yeah.
We're going to get to this paper,
Okay.
but I actually really like the introduction because
Okay.
I thought their introduction hit the nail on the head about all the stuff to date around toilets and the controversies and the research and to where they're currently at, and then literally they did it in about 2 paragraphs. And so we've talked about in the past that the toilets can be an important source of potential contamination.
Which actually goes against what my parents always told me when I was young, which is you can't catch anything off a toilet seat.
Of a
But
toilet seat.
we now know that they weren't actually infection prevention specialists.
Yeah, well, that's true. Or coke addicts.
Oh, yeah.
Who tend to snort a fair bit off
turns out,
toilets
no,
in
they
public
weren't.
places.
No.
Anyway,
Yeah, we digress.
so they sort of pointed out in their introduction that norovirus from other work has been demonstrated in restaurants, have demonstrated and linked to numerous outbreaks, and that was Charles Gerber's work as well. But they showed in that previous work that there's a real risk associated with contacts with entrance doors,
Yeah.
with toilet seats,
Yeah.
basically touching anything you go in and out of in a public restroom or toilet is a potential risk of contamination.
Especially in an eating establishment as well.
Yeah,
It's got to go to your mouth.
that's right.
That's a
And it's funny because I was involved in a recent, they wanted some infection control advice on a recent redesign of a building. And they had the engineers and the architects, and I said, look, we don't need doors and toilets. These were generally public visitor-facing toilets. And they looked at me with blank faces, and I said, we don't want doors for lots of reasons, and I explained why. I said, we can create this, I'm sure, within the same space without having to have a door.
Which is actually an excellent point, because if you go to an airport, you walk around in a sort of an S shape, and so you don't need doors.
Yeah. So anyway, unfortunately, the long story short of that story is that never happened, and there's doors in those toilets.
Doors everywhere.
The building that I now inhabit. Anyway, the other interesting work from Gerber in the past is some stuff around closing the toilet lid.
Oh, yes.
And
Such a controversial area.
do you close or not close the toilet lid? Closing lid does not necessarily reduce the risk of contamination on surfaces.
No, it probably changes the direction, but not the risk.
So again, that was in this introduction. They also pointed to a paper from Scott and Bloomfield, which I looked up, and it was way back in 1985. Martin, that's might have been you might have been like 20 years into your career by then, but I'm only
thanks.
But there was I looked this study up because I thought, hang on, this is quite interesting, and I love these practical sort of studies. And what they were looking at, they were comparing a range of things, and one of them was cleaning, I think it was detergent. Then they were using chlorine once a day or disinfectant once a day, and then they used a continuous chlorine disinfection process in the actual water to see whether that reduced contamination. They found that it was a little bit better using continuous chlorine, but that recontamination, if you're just doing it once a day with a disinfectant, was quite quick.
Probably chlorine is it gets deactivated by organic matter, and the whole purpose of the toilet is to accept a lot of organic matter.
Yes, that's right. That's right. So you can see why once a day with a disinfectant is probably useless.
No. Yeah.
Equally, imagine continuously flushing with a disinfectant. That can't be great for the environment either.
No.
So anyway, that was an interesting one. Then they referred to a UVC study, and that was from Donsky's group, and that there's some real value in potential UVC in terms of contamination.
You're talking far UV, or the UV comes on at a high level when...
It was far UV, I believe, because it was in restrooms.
That's going to be continuous, can't it?
Yeah. But the downside, as I understood it from that, was it took 24 hours for C. difficile to see noticeable reductions.
Yeah.
And 45 minutes for bacteriophages that they were using as surrogates. So in reality, that's too long.
Yeah.
In my mind, people are using these public or shared toilets potentially more frequently than...
Well, I mean, it might help the odd transmission, but it's not going to help you in an outbreak situation where a lot of people run into the toilet because they've either got it coming out of the top or the bottom end.
Yeah.
And so the contamination levels are going to go through the roof at that point.
Yeah. Actually, I digress for a minute. I was in the bathrooms today at the airport, and I was unsure when I went into the bathroom. I thought, oh, hang on, there's no urinals here. Maybe I've accidentally walked into the female toilet. And then I turned to the right and saw all the cubicles. I went, oh, this is a bit odd, all cubicles. But all the cubicle seats were up. So I then realised that must be the gents. Anyway. So, again, just before we get onto this paper, because I think all this is important lead up, there was another recent paper that I saw. Chiara Higman in the UK, Kath Noakes was one of the authors on that paper, and it was in a journal that we often read, the Infection Prevention and Control.
Indoor air?
Indoor environments.
Oh, indoor environments.
Yes, yeah. And this shows the value of looking at such really different discipline journals.
Yeah. Written normally for people who really know what they're doing in that field, unlike me.
Science journals.
Yes.
And they were interested, and they developed a framework, or the plan was to develop a framework to evaluate the risk of a susceptible person going into a shared toilet after someone had been there. And they wanted to see so if someone had done a number 2 and they flushed, what was the risk to the subsequent person? And they were trying to develop a model. The story, again, the short answer to that was they defined this as the model suggested a non-negligible risk, which to me means there is a risk.
There's a risk, yeah. I suppose it would depend on what the previous person had deposited.
Yes.
Whether it was a bacterium you're interested in, or a spore, or a virus.
So they looked at SARS-CoV-2 and they looked at norovirus, which, they're obviously common.
Topical.
Topical, yeah. So the model suggests that norovirus has a 2 times greater risk than SARS-CoV-2 in terms of contamination. Now, this is a thing I found really interesting. So, without being graphic, Martin, because I don't think you've read this paper, so you don't know the answer.
No, I don't.
And this is why I didn't tell you.
A lot of things,
this is why I didn't tell you about this paper deliberately when I said I've got another paper.
So devious.
So, what do you think is a bigger risk? Someone goes in, they do a number 2 in the toilet, and they sit there for a really long period of time.
Well, like they were reading the paper,
or whatever it might be. Or they might have a problem, or whatever.
Or the sports.
Well, maybe a longer period of time, shall we say? It's a longer period of time compared to a shorter period. Compare that to how fast you go to the room after someone's done that. which do you think would pose the greater risk for transmission?
Well, my first question is, are they actually sitting on the toilet?
Yes, the theory says it's a fecal transmission.
So if they're actually sitting on the toilet, it's a man, because I know the ladies hover because they don't want to catch some sexually transmitted disease. That's a digression. I'm thinking probably the person who does it quickly, but I don't know the answer to that. So have I guessed right?
No. Interestingly, they say that occupancy time, which is the time you're sitting on the toilet, has less of a risk compared to the time post-flush.
So it's actually a really good thing to do Wordles, etc. while you're on
Well,
the
no,
toilet.
it's not. It's saying the best thing you can do is not about, oh, God, that person's been on the toilet for 10 minutes. That's going to cause me a risk. No. Your best measure is to wait 60 seconds or longer after they have flushed before you go into that room, into that cubicle. That's, in this model, suggests that will reduce the risk of transmission.
The chances of that nobody jumping in between you and the toilet while you sat and count for 60 seconds is a bit slim, though. That's the issue,
But I guess it's also...
Unless you could design a door that shuts for 60 seconds and before it allows the next person in. Yeah,
that's true. I think this shows the practical things that could be implemented. So if you had an issue in the ward or a setting where there was only the one toilet and there was some risk of infection of a particular pathogen, that you might go, okay,
I'll give it 5.
To be honest,
I have been in toilets where somebody's come out before me and said to me, I'll give it a minute.
Yeah, well, so there's some science out there.
So, well, I suspect that wasn't the thought of their mind at the moment.
Probably wasn't.
At the time.
But that could be... It could be one thing in some circumstances where you might go, well, we can't afford to get this cleaned 6 times a day.
No.
Or we have the ventilation in there is really bad.
Often terrible, to be fair.
So maybe if we wait a little bit longer, some of this risk will reduce somewhat.
Yeah.
It also probably shows the value of improving, it shows the value to me of improving the need to improve ventilation in these. And you think about where toilets are, they're often in some dingy corner in an E-L building.
The afterthought, isn't it? Oh, yeah, everybody sticks in the toilet.
So thinking about that, or how you can get air purification or cleaner air in it, or whatever it might be. So, and that goes back to some of those other things I mentioned earlier about continuous thing and UVC. And so, anyway, I found their introduction to this paper fascinating, and they led me down the sort of rabbit hole of.
We probably should actually talk about the paper.
We should, because we probably have no time to talk about the paper now. So they were interested in this paper about toilet flushing and restroom, and this is the context of restroom facilities, and it was really to investigate this idea of a sanitizing spray at reducing the risk. So if you sprayed a sanitizing spray after you've been to the restroom, does that have any potential benefit? And one of the reasons that they came from this was previous work where it's been shown that a glycerol-based aerosolized formulation can provide damage to those viruses. And this is in the context of viruses, this paper, not bacteria.
It is virus. Because Charles Gerber, to be fair, has done an awful lot of work in these sort of settings, to the point where he's done some observational work in toilets where he's had his collar felt by the police. He's been reported to them a few times, so that's a bit tricky. But this is a product which is, if I read it correctly, it's actually ethanol plus glycerol. So the glycerol helps it hang in the air, and the ethanol has the main killing agent.
And they do say it could provide or produce structural and molecular damage in gram-negative and gram-positive bacteria.
We know alcohol does.
So it makes sense.
Yeah. It might affect other organisms.
So they put this bacteriophage added to the toilet, they flushed it, and then they looked at cross-examination, and that's done through methods I'm not going to get into, but if you want to read the paper, it goes into the science.
The method is robust.
It is, and it's repeatable, and it's the same method that all these types of studies are using now. When they look at contamination of the environment through aerosols, they are using a same sort of framework, the quantitative microbial risk assessment approach to assessing these types of things, which is great. Because if you think about cleaning, and again, I digress for a minute, we've got all these different outcomes we look at when we think about effectiveness of cleaning, and But then how do you swab? How much do you swab? What surface area do you swab? How big do you swab?
Yeah.
What type of swab do you use? What media do you use?
Yeah.
So it's good that the scientists, in this instance, have already got all that in hand. But anyway, the idea was then that they then use that sanitizing spray or a surface disinfectant spray.
Yeah, so they used two, didn't they? They used an air sanitizing spray plus a disinfectant that's meant to be sprayed on surfaces that isn't designed to be sprayed into the air. I think that was the distinction there.
They showed large reductions in cross-contamination of fomites with the air sanitizer. It did depend a little bit on the location and the duration of the spray, as you could imagine. The use of the air sanitizer reduced viral contamination only around the toilet seat after spraying for about 8 seconds. And after a 30-second spray, it reduced it on a range of restroom surfaces. And then they also looked at air contamination, and it was reduced after the use of the air sanitizer. And this was in contrast to the hard surface disinfectant spray, which is sprayed in the air.
Yeah.
And the effect of that was negligible. So, we saw in COVID disinfectants being sprayed around.
Oh, yeah.
And it just shows you can't just get any old disinfectant,
chuck it in the air,
spray it in the air, and think it's going to have any value.
No. It needs to have something that's actually going to help it suspend in the air for a reasonable period of time.
And be designed for that purpose.
And to give contact time before it hits the surface.
Yeah. So you're designing something that's fit for purpose, not retrofit. So, I guess their conclusion was that this air sanitizing spray can reduce airborne pathogen exposure, including norovirus.
And I'm struggling a little bit with that because they used MST2, which is a non-envelope virus, bacteriovirus, but norovirus is a non-envelope virus, and we know that alcohols are not that effective against non-envelope viruses. So it's a bit of a leap to say MST2 is equivalent to norovirus, because I'm not sure we know that. So I would like to see them repeat this with actual norovirus or during an outbreak scenario, because I could think of settings where actually if you could do this in a setting where somebody was having active symptoms with norovirus, like a nursing or residential home where they're traditionally very difficult to decontaminate the environment because of the soft furnishings, etc. But if you had a shared area where everyone's going to the toilet, I think there is some potential. But there's also a downside in that the actual instructions for use of this substance say you have to allow 12 minutes before the next person's going in.
Or at least 60 seconds.
Well, the manufacturer says 12 minutes.
Yeah.
And if you've got norovirus outbreak, 12 minutes is a long time, especially if you've got your hands over your mouth and your legs crossed. So I thought it was really interesting work.
Yeah. I guess that would be the holy grail for most researchers, to be able to use norovirus, but we know how that's near impossible to do that kind of study.
But you might be able to expect, in an outbreak scenario, would it make a difference? The problem is predicting where your norovirus outbreak is going to come. But there is times of the year where a lot of establishments might have norovirus, but the practicalities are tricky. Does it automatically fire something into the air when the door is shut, and then the door is kept shut for a period to allow ventilation, or do you actually fit an extract? I mean, ventilation is key, so that when you shut the door, air is extracted and what's left is sprayed. I don't know. It's interesting.
It is interesting, and that's why I thought it'd be a good one to chat about.
Yeah.
I probably can't read. I found it interesting. It's a good topic to talk about. I think toilets are this evolving issue.
There's a shitload of papers now.
You had to throw that in.
I've been waiting for an opportunity since we started speaking. But to be fair,
we'll have to put on YouTube now. This isn't a clean version of professional.
Well, it wouldn't be anyway. But there are that many papers coming out on Plume, and people concerned about these areas. All the MDR gram negatives, that's where they go. So more work in this area, a bit of science, because basically it hasn't changed much since Thomas Crapper designed the toilet a long time ago.
Good name, that one.
It was.
And the other interesting thing that just crossed my mind as we're chatting is, how obviously sinks have been this evolving problem, and they've probably always been a problem. We just didn't know about it. So, but with a lot more interest and focus on sinks, and rightly so. But toilets, I think, could another few years, I reckon we're going to be going, oh, hang on, There's all these risks with toilets we didn't actually realise. And, you know, we saw, I think we might have talked about in a previous podcast about that study that compared, the European study that compared ICUs that had sinks and didn't have sinks, and the association with the number of sinks. Genie. I wonder if anyone wants to do a study or a bit of a retrospective review or looking at the number of toilets in a facility and transmission, in ward settings, I guess is probably the best.
It could be the number one or number two most important thing.
And on that big bombshell and piece of pun, Martin, been good catching up with you.
Always.
And thanks for listening on the latest edition of Infection Control Matters.